In the winter of 1906, a basement darkroom in Prague filled with the breath of chemical fog. A glass plate slid through the developer, then rose into lamplight that trembled against walls and tin trays. On its pale surface, a woman sat beside a window with folded hands, her gaze turned toward an empty street. The exposure held firm edges that refused to soften, and the shading along her cheekbone matched an afternoon Sunday. Nothing in the frame wavered except one impossible fact that fastened itself to all who stood beneath the lamp. When the print dried, a clerk recognized the face, crossed himself, and summoned a household from the next ward. They studied the image in silence, then spoke her name like a prayer they had kept for 12 years. The woman was Mária Juránová, buried on the 3rd of September 1894, and never photographed once during the span of her life. The plate came from an unclaimed bundle in a wooden crate, carried through winters by careless ledgers and anonymous hands. How does a face return to light 12 years after the body is gone? This account draws on letters, receipts, and a studio ledger kept behind a warped door. Prague in the first decade of the 20th century was a city poised between centuries. Its medieval towers still darkened the skyline, yet its cafes whispered with talk of modern science, spiritualism, and art. Gas lamps flickered across cobblestone alleys, and the Vltava carried both smoke and fog into the quarters where photographers rented cramped rooms. The city had become a place where invention and superstition lived side by side. Telegraph wires buzzed over rooftops, while fortune tellers laid cards on velvet tables. 19th century beliefs had not fully loosened their grip, and death still carried rituals heavy with candles, relics, and whispered prayers. In this setting, the sudden materialization of a face on glass was bound to stir unrest.
To understand the weight of that image, we must step back to the life it seemed to recall. Mária Juránová was born in 1,867 inches, a working-class district near the city's edge.
Her father worked in a tannery and her mother sold lace in market stalls. Neighbors remembered her as a quiet figure, her voice soft but steady, the kind of presence that seemed to withdraw from noise. She married at 24, only to be widowed 2 years later when influenza swept through Prague in the winter of 1891. Afterward, she lived with her sister, helping raise nieces and nephews. By all accounts, she never sought her own portrait. Photography was still an expensive vanity in her circles. The only images her family owned were of infants dressed in white for baptism or of sons conscripted into the army. Women like Mária passed through life remembered by face alone, not by print. Her death in 1894 was unremarkable in the city's records. She succumbed to what doctors labeled a pulmonary weakness, a vague phrase applied to countless women whose lungs gave way to tuberculosis or chronic fevers. She was interred in Olsztyny Cemetery, Prague's vast necropolis where ivy smothered stone and processions wound endlessly through iron gates. The family marked her grave with a modest cross and candle niches. No photograph was taken before burial. The family had neither means nor thought to summon a camera into mourning. In their home, her absence lingered in worn furniture, not in portraits.
12 years passed. Prague shifted. Art Nouveau facades sprouted, and the empire tightened its hold. Meanwhile, photography advanced quickly.
Dry plates replaced fragile wet collodion methods, and amateur societies gathered to experiment with exposures. One such society operated near the Charles Bridge, maintaining a shared darkroom where hobbyists could rent time. It was here, in the final months of 1906, that a crate of glass plates was retrieved from a storeroom. Dust and mildew clung to the wrappings. No label indicated the owner. The plates had likely been abandoned when a member failed to renew his subscription. They were catalogued for cleaning and printing, if only to clear space. The man who worked that evening, records suggest, was a journeyman photographer named Joseph Havel. He was not a mystic, but a technician concerned with timing, mixtures, and the precise shade that emerged from silver salts. When he placed the plate into solution, he expected a botched exposure or meaningless blur. Instead, as chemicals coaxed shadows into substance, He saw the outline of a woman seated by a window. The clarity was extraordinary. He noted the furniture, the folds of her skirt, the faint cross of a rosary slipping between her fingers. It was not the smudge of a double exposure, but the full impression of a sitter. He dried the plate, puzzled, and moved on. Only when an assistant entered did recognition strike. The assistant, Antonin, claimed the face belonged to the Juranova family, whose house stood a few blocks away. Against Joseph's protests, Antonin carried the print to them. They gasped, named her instantly Mária, and swore no photograph had ever been taken in her lifetime. Letters preserved from that winter confirmed their astonishment. One cousin wrote, "It is her, it is she as we remember, by the window where she would sit on afternoons." But there was no camera, no glass. This is where the paradox crystallizes. If the plate originated in the club's storeroom, who exposed it? The society's logbooks contained no entry for the Juranova name. The furniture in the picture resembled none of the society's sets. The window was not their own, but seemed part of a modest home interior. And yet the likeness was undeniable. Even skeptics conceded the resemblance was too precise for chance. Thus, in the cold streets of Prague, a family found themselves confronted with the return of a face they had mourned for over a decade. A woman without a single portrait in life now stared back from glass. The event unsettled more than kinship. It challenged the trust people placed in photography itself. Until then, the camera was thought to be the most faithful witness, an instrument that transcribed light without bias. If a photograph could carry across years after death, what else might it reveal or fabricate? The discovery of the photograph did not remain confined to one household. Within weeks, the story moved beyond the Juranova family and began to circulate among neighbors, then among amateur photographers who rented time in the same darkroom. By January 1907, whispers of the plate that came from nowhere reached the pages of small Prague gazettes. One column referred to it as Zahadný portrait, Ženy zesnulé, the mysterious portrait of a deceased woman. What unsettled readers was not simply the possibility of a ghost caught in silver nitrate, but the clarity of the likeness. Unlike the blurred figures common in so-called spirit photography, this was sharp, ordinary, domestic. Mária sat as though alive. Sunlight falling across her cheek, her expression neither tragic nor spectral, but calm. The earliest investigations came from within the Photographic Society itself. Members searched their registers for any indication that a Juranova relative had commissioned a portrait in the 1,890 seconds. None appeared. They then examined the batch of glass plates from which the image had emerged. Most were damaged negatives of street views, parades, and failed exposures. Only one held the seated woman. Its emulsion was intact, suggesting it had been carefully stored, yet the plate bore no studio stamp, no penciled note of ownership. Speculation flourished. Some insisted the likeness must be coincidental. Perhaps another woman, photographed years earlier, happened to resemble the deceased. But the Juranova family rejected this outright. They pointed to specific details: the tilt of Mária's brow, the narrow line of her mouth, and even the rosary beads she habitually carried. A neighbor recalled, "She sat often by that window with the same beads in her lap. We all knew the sight." Others leaned toward explanations rooted in photography's trickery. Since the 1,860 seconds, Europe had been enthralled by spirit photographers who claimed to capture the dead beside the living. In London, William Mumler had produced portraits of sitters accompanied by pale apparitions. In Paris, photographers staged séances and superimposed faint figures through double exposures. Most of these images were vague, easily dismissed as deliberate fraud. Yet believers saw them as proof that the camera could pierce veils unseen by the eye. The Prague case, however, did not fit neatly into that tradition. The exposure was not faint but direct. No second figure hovered, no blur suggested manipulation. This was not an apparition clinging to a relative's shoulder, but a full portrait of the deceased herself.
Critics argued that if it were double exposure, there must be a second negative layered atop the first, but Josef Havel, the technician, swore he had developed the plate in standard fashion. He wrote in a letter to his brother, "The plate was clean when it entered the bath. There was no residue, no fogging. Only after moments did her likeness appear, whole and undeniable." By spring of 1907, the photograph had been shown discreetly at several gatherings. A clergyman studied it and urged the family to destroy the print, fearing it might invite unrest among parishioners. Instead, they hid it in a chest, bringing it out only for select visitors. One of these visitors, a Czech folklorist named Karel Doležal, recorded their account in his notebooks. He compared the event to older legends in which images of saints appeared unbidden on walls or cloth. To him, the plate was a modern relic, an imprint beyond human intent. Yet skepticism remained fierce. Some proposed that the woman in the photo might not be Mária at all, but her sister, photographed unknowingly. Others questioned whether memory had betrayed the family, convincing them of resemblance because they longed for it. But when side-by-side sketches were made from witnesses' descriptions of Mária, they matched the photograph with uncanny precision. As debate deepened, attention turned to the timeline. If Mária had died in 1894, the photograph must have been taken before that date. But who owned the camera? The Juranova household never employed a photographer. No neighbor recalled a sitting. Could someone have captured her without her knowledge, through an open window, or in a fleeting visit? If so, why was the plate never developed until 1906? This gap of 12 years became the case's central enigma. Some theorists proposed that the emulsion itself might have retained an impression for years, only revealing it when finally immersed in chemicals. Photographic science did not support this, yet the notion intrigued spiritualists. They claimed the plate had absorbed not only light but essence, holding it until the right moment. One pamphlet published in Prague in 1908 suggested, just as relics retain virtue, so may glass retain presence. The photograph was not taken in her life but in her death, when her shade lingered. Parallel cases surfaced. Reports circulated of plates revealing faces of strangers never present during the exposure. In Vienna, a photographer claimed a negative of an empty chair developed into the likeness of his late wife. In Budapest, a society journal mentioned an image of a man long dead appearing in a family portrait. These stories, often dismissed as hoaxes, nonetheless provided a backdrop against which the Juranova photograph gained notoriety. The family, meanwhile, wrestled with unease. Some relatives regarded the image as a gift, proof that Mária remained among them. Others saw it as a disturbance, a refusal of the dead to rest. In April 1907, one cousin suffered a sudden illness, and whispers linked it to the photograph's presence. The connection was never proven, but fear deepened. By the end of that year, the print vanished from public sight. Accounts differ. Some say the family buried it with a relative, others that it was locked away in a parish archive. What remains are testimonies, letters, newspaper clippings, and the notes of folklorist Doležal. Through them we glimpse a chain of events that might otherwise dissolve into rumor. Yet the absence of the plate did not erase its influence. The case lingered in memory, fueling debates about the reliability of photography itself. Could a photograph lie? Could it capture not only light, but what dwells beyond? In Prague's coffee houses, where scientists and poets mingled, such questions found eager ears. Some insisted the camera was infallible, and the likeness must have earthly cause. Others whispered that technology had opened a door it could not close. By 1909, the story of the Juranova photograph was already legend, half cautionary tale, half relic of mystery. Its details varied with each telling, but one point remained constant. A woman who had never posed for a portrait appeared on a plate years after her burial. Whether artifact or apparition, it unsettled the boundary between memory and evidence, between presence and absence. As the decade turned, the Juranova photograph became less a family curiosity and more a matter of contention for those who believed that every anomaly hid a truth waiting to be unearthed. By 1910, Prague had grown restless with both progress and uncertainty.
Telegraph lines bound the city into new circuits of information, but rumours still carried equal weight. Among those rumours, none clung tighter than the tale of the woman who reappeared 12 years after her burial. In that year, an investigation quietly gathered momentum. A professor of physics at Charles University, František Malý, became determined to test the claims. He was known for his strict rationalism, often mocking spiritualist circles, but even he admitted that the testimonies of so many unrelated witnesses demanded scrutiny. He persuaded the Photographic Society to allow him access to their logbooks, crates, and the chemical formulas in use. For weeks, he examined the accounts, noting dates, suppliers, and techniques. The absence of an entry under the Juranova name remained a puzzle. Malý concluded, if this image exists, it must result from a misfiled plate, not a visitation. Yet one evening, while sifting through letters preserved by folklorist Doležal, Malý found a detail that disrupted his certainty. A cousin had written that Mária often sat by a window facing the courtyard with the great mulberry tree. The photograph indeed showed such a tree, its leaves casting patterned shade against the glass. Malý visited the family home and confirmed the match. The window and tree stood exactly as described. This meant the plate could not have been staged elsewhere. It captured that very room. But who had placed a camera there, and how had it entered the Society's archives? Tension deepened when another witness came forward, an elderly neighbour who recalled seeing a man with a camera case in the courtyard during the summer of 1,894 weeks before Mária's death. She thought him a friend of the family, but never learnt his name. Could he have taken the clandestine photograph? If so, why had the image not surfaced until a dozen years later?
Spiritualists seized upon the uncertainty. They invited the Juranova relatives to seances, promising contact with Mária's spirit.
Some claimed that the photograph itself was the message, proof that the dead could still be seen. A pamphlet published in 1911 declared, she allowed herself to be taken not by lens, but by memory imprinted on glass. Death cannot erase the face when light itself conspires to preserve it. At this juncture, the photograph ceased to be a single enigma and became a battlefield between science and belief. Malý staged a lecture demonstration, projecting slides of common photographic errors, ghosting from double exposure, streaks from damaged emulsions. He argued that the Juranova plate was likely such an accident, but when pressed, he could not reproduce an error that yielded a likeness so precise. His students left unconvinced, whispering that their professor had explained nothing. Meanwhile, the family's secrecy added to the mystery. Some whispered that the plate had been stolen, others that the church had confiscated it. A rumor spread that the negative cracked when exposed to daylight, as though resisting examination. None of these tales could be verified, but they spread across Prague's taverns, embedding themselves in collective memory. The climax of the story came when a small group of investigators, Malý, Doležal, and two society members met in the Juranova house in late 1911. They examined every corner of the windowed room, measured the angle of sunlight, and compared it to the shadows in the photograph. The alignment was exact. Doležal recorded in his notes, either the plate was taken in this room, or it is a miracle of coincidence so great as to mock reason. One final discovery sealed the photograph's place in legend. While searching the attic of the Photographic Society, clerks uncovered fragments of correspondence from the mid-1890s. Among them was a torn envelope addressed to Jehovah family with no given name. Inside, faint pencil notes described an order, one plate, sitting by window to be collected. No signature identified the photographer. The order had never been fulfilled, and the envelope had been lost among receipts. This fragment suggested that someone, perhaps a distant relative, had indeed arranged for a portrait. But why had the family never collected it? Why had they sworn no photograph was ever taken? Some suspected shame or secrecy. Perhaps a suitor or a neighbour with motives unknown had captured her likeness without the family's consent. Others maintained that even if such an order existed, it did not explain the 12-year delay, nor the eerie timing of the photograph's return. Thus, all paths converged on an unsettling truth. There was evidence enough to suggest an earthly explanation, yet gaps so wide they could only be bridged by the imagination. Whether by hidden photographer, clerical error, or spectral intervention, the result was the same. A woman long dead looked out from a print as though alive, her calm gaze daring the living to question their own certainty. For Prague's citizens, the climax was not a solution but a revelation of limits. Photography, once trusted as pure fact, now seemed capable of harboring riddles, and in the flicker of lamplight on glass they confronted the possibility that truth might remain forever split between what is seen and what is believed. When the excitement of the investigation faded, what remained was not resolution but silence. The Juranova family withdrew from discussion, refusing further interviews. By 1912, the photograph itself had disappeared from circulation. Whether destroyed, concealed in parish custody, or locked in a family chest, no one could say. The void left behind became fertile ground for speculation. In absence, the story grew larger, until it was no longer about one woman or one glass plate, but about the fragile trust humans placed in images. Prague entered the years of war and upheaval. Men marched off to the front, and cameras captured them in uniforms before they vanished into mud. Amid this atmosphere of loss, the tale of Maria's reappearing face returned in hushed conversations. Widows repeated it in kitchens, that a photograph could summon a loved one back from the grave. Soldiers whispered that perhaps their faces too would linger on plates, even if their bodies never came home. The story became less a riddle and more a kind of dark comfort. Folklorist Karel Dolezal, who had preserved letters and testimonies, tried to publish an account in 1915. Wartime censors rejected it, fearing it would spread superstition. His notes remained in private archives, only resurfacing decades later. By then, the photograph itself was irretrievable. What survived were echoes, a cousin's handwriting, a professor's lecture transcript, the memory of a window, and a mulberry tree. The object at the center had vanished, leaving only testimony like a ghost whose presence is known but never seen. What makes this episode endure is not its lack of solution, but its challenge to certainty. Photography was meant to be evidence, a mechanical witness immune to imagination. Yet here was a case where the camera seemed to conspire with mystery, producing not clarity but confusion. Was it coincidence, deception, or something beyond? The absence of the plate ensures the answer will never be settled. In that way, the story mirrors grief itself. The face of the lost appears vivid in memory, undeniable yet unreachable. Modern readers may dismiss it as error, a mislabeled plate, a mistaken identity. Skepticism is healthy, yet the persistence of the tale reveals something deeper. We long for images to anchor us against time, to prove that what we loved was real. When an image defies time, appearing after death, it touches the boundary where memory, faith, and fear converge. That is why the Juranova photograph lingers, not as evidence in a case file, but as an emblem of uncertainty. Today, if one visits Olsztyny Cemetery, the mulberry tree no longer stands. The window where Mária once sat has been boarded, the building repurposed. Yet some visitors still pause there, recalling the account of the woman who was never photographed in life but found in death. They look at the glass panes, half expecting a face to glow back at them. None appears, but the silence feels charged, as though memory itself has been imprinted on the walls. And so the tale closes where it began, with a woman by a window, seen when she should not have been seen. Whether conjured by light, chemistry, or longing, her image escaped the grave. The photograph that should not exist continues to haunt, not because it proves life after death, but because it proves the limits of our explanations. We want certainty, yet sometimes the past hands us only a shadow that refuses to fade. Do you believe the camera simply misled its keepers, or that a face truly returned from beyond? Share your thoughts below. We are listening.